The torch flames danced across Mei Lin's bald scalp as 20 angry men surrounded her in the town square. Her head had been shaved so roughly that fresh cuts still wept blood down her neck, creating dark rivulets that stained the collar of her torn cotton dress. The purple bruises around her eyes made her look like a ghost in the flickering light, but her dark eyes burned with a fire that made even the bravest men step back. She clutched a small leather journal against her chest while the mob pressed closer, their voices rising like hungry wolves seeking blood. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward with his gun drawn, his weathered face twisted with the kind of hatred that comes from desperation and fear. "Give us that book, girl, and maybe we'll make this quick." His voice carried across the silent square. But beneath the threat, Mei Lin could hear something else. Terror. Because they all knew what was written in those pages could destroy every one of them, and the girl holding it had nothing left to lose. But Mei Lin knew what was written in those pages would either save her life or destroy half the town of Cedar Falls. The names, the dates, the money trails that connected every corrupt official from the lowest deputy to the territorial judge to the human trafficking ring that had brought her here as cargo 3 years ago. Her voice came out as a whisper at first, but every word cut through the night air like a blade forged in suffering. "You want this book? Then everyone will know what you did to the others. What you did to my sister Jade." The sheriff's hand trembled slightly on his weapon, and behind him, Mayor Patterson's face went pale as moonlight. The crowd shifted nervously as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about silencing one escaped girl anymore. This was about covering up murders, corruption, and crimes that would bring federal marshals down on their heads like the wrath of God. Before we continue, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The crowd shifted nervously as whispers spread through their ranks like wildfire through dry grass. Some of these men had families, children who looked up to them as heroes and protectors of their community. They hadn't signed up for murder when they'd agreed to keep quiet about Chen's business dealings, just for looking the other way and collecting their monthly payments. But the journal in Mei Lin's hands contained evidence that would hang half of them as accessories to murder and destroy the other half financially and socially. Deputy Wilson wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool October night, his conscience wrestling with his fear. "Sheriff, maybe we should think about this. There might be another way to handle this situation." His voice cracked with uncertainty, but Morrison's cold eyes never left the defiant girl standing in the center of their circle. The sheriff had come too far and committed too many sins to turn back now, but even he could feel the crowd's resolve beginning to crack. Mei Lin's fingers tightened on the leather cover as the memories of her sister's final moments 3 weeks ago crashed over her like a devastating wave. Jade had tried to escape from Chen's brothel, where they'd been forced to work since arriving as terrified children, and Chen had made an example of her in front of all the other girls to prevent future escape attempts. The image of her sister's broken body still haunted every sleeping moment, but now it fueled her courage instead of her nightmares. She was only 14, Mei Lin said, her voice growing stronger with each word, carrying the weight of righteous fury. 14 years old, and you animals killed her because she wanted to go home to our parents. The sheriff's jaw clenched, his finger hovering over the trigger, but she wasn't finished speaking her truth. But she wasn't the first girl to die protecting your dirty secrets, was she? How many other children have been murdered to keep your corruption hidden from the world? The journal felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the power to destroy lives and expose a web of corruption that reached from the lowest deputy to the highest territorial officials. Mei Lin had spent months carefully documenting every transaction, every name, every horrific detail of the operation that had stolen her childhood and murdered her beloved sister. She'd written down dates when girls disappeared, amounts of money that changed hands, and the names of every man who'd participated in or profited from their suffering. Now, surrounded by the very men responsible for turning Cedar Falls into a haven for human traffickers and murderers, she realized this moment would decide everything that followed. Live or die. She would not let Jade's death be meaningless or allow these monsters to continue destroying innocent lives. "You have a choice," she said, her voice carrying across the silent square with the authority of someone who had nothing left to fear. "Let me walk out of here alive with this evidence, or watch your whole world burn when this book reaches the territorial authorities and federal marshals." Sheriff Morrison's finger moved to the trigger, but the doubt creeping into his eyes told her that some battles were won with truth before the first shot was ever fired. 3 years earlier, Mei Lin and her younger sister Jade had arrived in Cedar Falls chained in the back of a wagon like livestock being transported to market. They were among 15 Chinese girls who had been promised work in American restaurants by smooth-talking recruiters who spoke their language and understood their desperate family's poverty. The journey from San Francisco had taken 2 weeks, during which they were fed scraps and allowed out of their chains only to relieve themselves under armed guard. Mei Lin, then 16, had tried to comfort 13-year-old Jade during the endless nights when their little sister cried for their mother and father back in Guangdong province. "We'll work hard and earn enough money to go home," she had whispered, not knowing that home was already lost to them forever. The other girls in the wagon ranged from 12 to 18, all sharing the same desperate hope that America would offer them the opportunities their families needed to survive. When they finally reached Cedar Falls, weak and terrified, Chunwei waited for them with a smile that never reached his cold eyes. Chunwei was a successful businessman in Cedar Falls, at least on the surface where respectable society could see him. He owned the largest restaurant in town, had investments in the silver mine, and donated generously to the church-building fund every Sunday. The townspeople saw him as a model immigrant who had embraced American values while maintaining his cultural heritage, but behind his public facade lay a much darker reality. His restaurant served as a front for a brothel that catered to miners, cowboys, and traveling businessmen who paid premium prices for young Asian girls. Chun had connections stretching back to San Francisco's Chinatown, where desperate families sold their daughters to pay debts or escape starvation. He spoke fluent English and had cultivated relationships with local officials who were willing to look the other way in exchange for regular payments and occasional favors. When the girls arrived, he explained the new reality of their situation with business-like efficiency that made their blood run cold with understanding. The basement beneath Chen's restaurant became their prison, a maze of small rooms where the girls were locked away when not working upstairs. Mei Lin and Jade were assigned to a cramped space barely large enough for the single mattress they shared, with walls so thin they could hear the sobs and prayers of the other girls throughout the endless nights. Chen's rules were simple and brutal. Work without complaint, never speak to customers about their situation, and accept that any attempt to escape would result in severe punishment for everyone. The girls who tried to resist were beaten until they submitted, and those who attempted escape were made examples of in front of the others. Mei Lin learned quickly that survival meant protecting Jade while appearing compliant. But inside, her hatred for Chun and his operation grew stronger each day. She began paying attention to conversations, memorizing names and faces, learning English from customers who didn't realize how much she understood. Knowledge, she realized, might be their only weapon against a system designed to break their spirits completely. The first year passed in a blur of horror and small rebellions that kept their humanity alive despite everything Chun tried to do to them. Mei Lin discovered she had a talent for remembering details, and she began secretly documenting the operation in her mind, storing away information about Chen's business partners, corrupt officials, and a network that supplied him with vulnerable girls. She learned that Sheriff Morrison received monthly payments to ignore complaints about Chen's establishment, that Mayor Patterson owned shares in Chen's legitimate businesses, and that even Judge Harrison had financial ties to the operation. Jade proved to be more fragile than her older sister, crying herself to sleep most nights and growing thinner despite Mei Lin's efforts to share her own meager food rations. "I want to go home," Jade would whisper in their shared language, and Mei Lin would hold her close while promising they would find a way. But as months turned into years, That promise felt more and more like a lie she told to keep them both from complete despair. By the beginning of their third year in Cedar Falls, Mei Lin had accumulated enough evidence in her memory to destroy Chen's entire operation, but she lacked the means to act on it. Then everything changed when Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived in town as the new physician, replacing the old doctor who had died of pneumonia the previous winter. Dr. Mitchell was a rare woman in medicine, educated back east and determined to help anyone who needed care regardless of their circumstances or ability to pay. When Jay became seriously ill with a fever that wouldn't break, Mei Lin took a desperate risk and brought her to the doctor's office after hours, pleading for help in broken English. Dr. Mitchell examined Jade with gentle hands and kind eyes, then looked at Mei Lin with growing understanding of their situation. "I'll help your sister," she said quietly, "but I need you to tell me the truth about what's happening to you girls." That night, sitting in the safety of the doctor's office while Jade slept peacefully for the first time in months, Mei Lin began to share the story that would eventually lead to Chen's downfall and her own desperate flight through the dark streets of Cedar Falls with evidence that could topple a corrupt empire. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's office became a sanctuary where Mei Lin could speak the truth for the first time in 3 years, her words tumbling out in a mixture of broken English and desperate gestures as she described the horror of their daily existence. The doctor listened without judgment, her face growing paler with each detail about Chen's operation and the network of corruption that protected it from interference. "We need evidence," Dr. Mitchell said finally, her voice steady despite the rage burning in her eyes. "Stories alone won't be enough to convince the territorial authorities, especially when half the town officials are involved." She provided Mei Lin with a small leather journal and taught her to write down everything she could remember with dates, names, and specific details that could be verified. "Document every transaction you witness, every visitor you recognize, every conversation you overhear," the doctor instructed. "This journal will become the weapon we use to destroy them all." Over the following weeks, Mei Lin filled page after page with meticulous records while Dr. Mitchell treated Jade's illness and slowly nursed her back to health with medicines and proper food. The breakthrough came when Mei Lin discovered Chen's private office during a night when he had too much whiskey and forgot to lock the door behind him. While he slept off his drunken stupor upstairs, she crept through his papers and found records that connected his operation to a vast network stretching across 3 territories. Bank statements showed payments to Sheriff Morrison, Mayor Patterson, and Judge Harrison, along with dozens of other officials who provided protection in exchange for regular bribes. Shipping manifests detailed the transport of girls from San Francisco, with notes about their ages, physical descriptions, and assigned destinations throughout the region. Most damning of all were the letters from prominent businessmen requesting specific types of girls for their establishments, treating human beings like livestock to be ordered from a catalog. Mei Lin's hands trembled as she copied the most important information into her journal, knowing she was risking her life with every word she wrote. The evidence was overwhelming, painting a picture of systematic corruption and human trafficking that would shock even the most cynical federal investigators. Chen's suspicions began growing after Dr. Mitchell started making inquiries about the girls' welfare, asking pointed questions about their health and legal status during her visits to treat sick customers. He noticed that Mei Lin had become more observant, her eyes following conversations, and her English improving faster than seemed natural for someone supposedly resigned to her fate. When he caught her near his office one morning, claiming she was cleaning nearby rooms, his paranoia transformed into active surveillance of her movements. "You've been different lately," he told her with cold eyes that missed nothing. "More attentive to things that don't concern you. I hope you're not developing ideas above your station." The threat was clear, but Mei Lin had gone too far to turn back now. She continued documenting evidence while teaching Jade to recognize the signs of approaching danger, preparing her little sister for the possibility that they might need to run without warning. The journal grew thicker with each passing day, but so did Chen's suspicions about her activities. The tension reached a breaking point when Chun discovered that Dr. Mitchell had been providing medical care to several of his girls without his permission or presence during the examinations. His rage was explosive and immediate, manifesting in new restrictions that confined the girls to the basement, except when working, and forbade any contact with outsiders without his direct supervision. "Someone has been talking," he announced to the terrified girls gathered in the main room, his voice carrying the promise of severe punishment. "Someone thinks they can betray my trust and face no consequences." His eyes lingered on Mei Lin longer than the others, and she felt the noose of his suspicion tightening around her neck like a rope. That night, she made the desperate decision to hide the journal in Dr. Mitchell's office, knowing that keeping it in the basement would mean certain death if Chin found it. The next morning, she could feel his eyes watching her every movement, waiting for her to make a mistake that would confirm his growing certainty about her betrayal. Chin's paranoia finally exploded into violence when he found Dr. Mitchell's medical supplies hidden in Jade's mattress, evidence of ongoing care that violated his strict rules about outside contact. His fury was terrible to witness as he dragged both sisters into the main room where all the other girls could see what happened to those who disobeyed his orders. "You want to play games with me?" he screamed to Mei Lin while his men held Jade's arms. "You think you can scheme behind my back without consequences?" The beating that followed was methodical and brutal, designed to break their spirits without damaging the merchandise too severely. But even as Chin's fists rained down on her, Mei Lin felt a savage satisfaction knowing that the evidence safely hidden in Dr. Mitchell's office would eventually destroy him and everyone who had profited from their suffering. When Jade whispered that she couldn't take much more of this existence, Mei Lin knew their time was running out and that soon they would need to make their escape attempt, regardless of the deadly consequences that would surely follow their flight from Chin's carefully constructed prison. The escape attempt came on a cold November night when Chin's attention was focused on entertaining a group of wealthy cattle ranchers who had ridden into town with money to spend and appetites to satisfy. Mei Lin had been watching their routine for weeks, memorizing the patterns of when guards changed shifts and which doors remained unlocked during busy nights. She and Jade waited until the sounds of drunken laughter filled the upstairs rooms, then slipped out through a basement window that Mei Lin had been slowly working loose for months. The autumn air bit at their skin through the thin cotton dresses that were all Chun allowed them to wear. But freedom felt sweeter than warmth as they crept through the shadows toward Dr. Mitchell's office, where the journal waited like a loaded weapon. "Stay close to me," Mei Lin whispered to her sister, whose hand trembled in hers like a frightened bird. "Once we get the evidence, we'll head to the telegraph office and send word to the territorial marshal." But even as she spoke the words, Mei Lin could hear shouting behind them as Chin's men discovered their absence and began organizing a search that would comb every inch of Cedar Falls. They made it 3 blocks before Chin's hunting party caught up to them in the alley behind the general store, their torches casting dancing shadows that turned familiar buildings into a nightmare landscape. Deputy Wilson was the first to spot them, his shout alerting the others who came running with the enthusiasm of men who knew their own necks depended on recapturing the escaped girls. "There they are," he yelled, pointing at the 2 small figures pressed against the brick wall like cornered animals. "Chin, we found your property." The word property hit Mei Lin like a physical blow, reminding her that in this town's eyes, she and Jade were nothing more than valuable objects to be retrieved and returned to their owner. Chun himself appeared moments later, his face twisted with rage and something darker that promised terrible retribution for their attempted escape. "Did you really think you could run from me?" he asked with deadly calm, his voice carrying across the alley like a judge pronouncing a death sentence. "Did you think I wouldn't find you in my own town?" The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal, with Chin's men surrounding the sisters while he decided their punishment for the humiliation they had caused him. Jade cowered behind Mei Lin, whose protective instincts flared into desperate courage as she faced the circle of hostile faces illuminated by flickering torchlight. "We're not your property," she said in English that was stronger and clearer than anyone expected, her voice cutting through the night air with surprising authority. "We're human beings, and what you've done to us is slavery and murder." Her words sent a ripple of unease through some of the men who had convinced themselves they were just looking the other way at questionable business practices rather than participating in something truly evil. But Chen's laughter was cold and merciless, filled with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. "You're whatever I say you are," he replied, stepping closer with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to absolute power over others. "And right now, you're a lesson that needs to be taught to keep the other girls from getting similar ideas about freedom." What happened next would haunt Mei Lin for the rest of her life, as Chen decided that Jade's death would serve as the perfect example to prevent future escape attempts by the other girls in his basement prison. The younger sister's pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears, as Chen's men held Mei Lin back, forcing her to watch while their leader demonstrated the cost of defying his authority. "This is what happens when you try to steal my property," Chen announced to his assembled men, ensuring they understood the stakes involved in maintaining their conspiracy of silence. "This is what happens when ungrateful girls forget their place in my organization." Jade's final moments were filled with terror and pain, but her eyes never left her sister's face, silently communicating forgiveness for all the things Mei Lin couldn't save her from. The sound that tore from Mei Lin's throat was barely human, a keen of grief and rage that echoed off the alley walls like the cry of a wounded animal. When it was over, Chan turned to Mei Lin with satisfaction gleaming in his cold eyes. "Now you understand the price of rebellion," he said softly. "Now you know what happens to girls who think they can escape their destiny." The aftermath of Jade's murder transformed Mei Lin from a frightened victim into something far more dangerous, as grief crystallized into a burning desire for justice that would consume everything in its path. Chun made the mistake of thinking that breaking her spirit would ensure her compliance, but instead he had created an enemy who now had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from his destruction. They dragged her back to the basement where the other girls waited in terrified silence. But Mei Lin was no longer the same person who had attempted escape just hours before. In her mind, she was already planning Chen's downfall with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to think like her captors in order to defeat them. The journal hidden in Dr. Mitchell's office contained enough evidence to destroy Chen's operation, but now Mei Lin wanted more than just his arrest. She wanted to expose every man who had participated in or profited from their suffering, to tear down the entire network of corruption that had allowed monsters like Chun to flourish in communities like Cedar Falls. As she lay on the thin mattress where she had once comforted Jade through nightmares, Mei Lin began formulating a plan that would either free them all or burn down half the town in the process of trying. The weeks following Jade's murder transformed Mei Lin into a ghost of herself, appearing compliant and broken while secretly gathering the final pieces of evidence needed to destroy Chen's empire. She moved through her daily routines like a sleepwalker, serving customers upstairs with dead eyes that no longer reflected hope or fear, only a cold calculation that made even the most hardened men uncomfortable. Chun believed he had finally broken her spirit completely, congratulating himself on eliminating her rebellious nature through the ultimate demonstration of his power over life and death. But behind her vacant expression, Mei Lin was memorizing every face, every conversation, every transaction that could add weight to the evidence already hidden in Dr. Mitchell's office. She had learned to become invisible in plain sight, a skill that allowed her to witness meetings and overhear discussions that revealed the true scope of the corruption poisoning Cedar Falls. "Perfect," Chen told his business associates, gesturing toward Mei Lin as she cleaned tables nearby. Sometimes a harsh lesson is the only way to ensure proper behavior and absolute loyalty. Dr. Mitchell had been devastated by the news of Jade's death, blaming herself for encouraging the escape attempt that had led to such tragic consequences. She continued treating Chen's girls when they became ill, but the interactions were strained and careful, both women knowing they were being watched for signs of continued conspiracy. During one medical visit, Mei Lin managed to slip the doctor a small note written in characters that looked like random scratches to anyone who couldn't read Chinese. The message was simple but urgent. "The evidence is ready. Help me finish this." Dr. Mitchell's slight nod was the only acknowledgement needed, and that night she began making preparations for the final phase of their plan to expose the truth about Chen's operation. She sent coded telegrams to contacts in the territorial capital, medical colleagues who had connections with federal law enforcement and who would understand the gravity of what she was reporting. "We're going to make them pay for what they did to your sister," she whispered during her next visit, speaking so quietly that only Mei Lin could hear her words of promise and revenge. Chen's confidence in his control over the situation led him to become careless about concealing his activities from prying eyes, believing that Jade's death had sent a clear message to anyone who might consider interfering with his business. He began holding meetings in his office with the door open, discussing shipments of new girls and payments to corrupt officials with the casual tone of someone arranging perfectly legal business transactions. Mei Lin absorbed every detail while appearing to focus entirely on her menial tasks, building a mental catalog of names, dates, and criminal activities that would provide prosecutors with enough evidence to dismantle the entire network. She learned that Judge Harrison was planning to retire soon and needed a large final payment to secure his silence about past cooperation, that Sheriff Morrison was demanding a bigger cut of the profits in exchange for increased protection, and that Mayor Patterson was growing nervous about federal attention to human trafficking in the territories. Most importantly, she discovered that Sean was expecting a new shipment of girls from San Francisco within the month, young Chinese immigrants whose families thought they were sending them to legitimate domestic work in American households. The breaking point came when Chen announced his plans for Mei Lin's future, revealing that he intended to sell her to a brothel in Denver, where her defiant spirit and knowledge of his operation would no longer pose a threat to his local business. "She's become too dangerous to keep here," he explained to his lieutenant, while Mei Lin pretended to sleep in her basement cell. "The other girls look to her for leadership, and I can see she's still planning something behind those dead eyes." The conversation confirmed what Mei Lin had suspected for weeks. She knew she wasn't as broken as she appeared, and her time in Cedar Falls was running out faster than she had anticipated. That night, she made contact with Dr. Mitchell through a method they had developed using laundry hanging patterns that would communicate urgent messages without requiring face-to-face meetings that might be observed by Chen's watchers. The signal meant only one thing. The time for waiting and gathering evidence had ended, and they needed to act immediately before Chen could ship her away from the only allies she had left in the world. Dr. Mitchell's response came the next morning in the form of a carefully orchestrated medical emergency that would provide cover for their final gambit against Chen's operation. She arrived at the restaurant claiming that several customers had reported symptoms of food poisoning, demanding immediate access to examine all the workers for signs of illness that might be spreading through the establishment. Chen couldn't refuse without arousing suspicion, so he reluctantly allowed the doctor to conduct her examinations while he watched nervously from nearby. During Mei Lin's examination, Dr. Mitchell whispered urgent instructions that would change everything. "Tonight, during the shift change at 10 o'clock, the back door will be unlocked. Take the journal and go straight to the telegraph office where Marshal Williams will be waiting." She pressed a small key into Mei Lin's hand along with a folded paper containing the marshal's description and identification. "This ends tonight," she continued, her voice filled with the quiet determination of someone who had seen too much suffering to remain passive any longer. "Whatever happens, remember that your sister's death will not be meaningless if we can save the others and bring these monsters to justice." As Dr. Mitchell packed her medical bag and prepared to leave, Mei Lin felt the familiar weight of destiny settling on her shoulders, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether justice would finally come to Cedar Falls or whether she would join Jade in death before dawn broke over the corrupted town. The 10 o'clock shift change approached with agonizing slowness as Mei Lin waited in the basement, every muscle in her body coiled like a spring ready to snap. The other girls sensed something was happening, their eyes following her movements with a mixture of hope and terror as they recognized the signs of another escape attempt brewing in the stifling air. Chen's guards had grown lazy over the months since Jade's death, convinced that the remaining girls were too broken and frightened to cause trouble, but Mei Lin had been studying their patterns with the patience of a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When the church bell tolled 10 times across the quiet town, she heard the familiar sound of boots on the stairs as the day guards headed home, and the night shift prepare to take their positions. The brief moment of chaos during the changeover would provide her only window of opportunity, a gap in their surveillance that might last no more than 60 seconds if she was lucky. She pressed her ear to the basement door, listening for the telltale sounds that would signal her moment to move, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The door opened silently under her touch, exactly as Dr. Mitchell had promised, and Mei Lin slipped through like a shadow, given substance by desperate determination. The kitchen above was empty except for dirty dishes and the lingering smell of cooked food, but she could hear voices from the front rooms where Chun was entertaining late customers with alcohol and promises of exotic pleasures. Every step across the wooden floor sounded like thunder in her ears, but she forced herself to move with careful precision rather than rushing headlong toward what might be freedom or death. The back exit stood 20 feet away, but it might as well have been 20 miles as she navigated around tables and chairs that could betray her location with a single careless bump. Behind her, she could hear Chin's laughter echoing from the main room, the sound filling her with such rage that she had to pause and steady herself against a wall before continuing toward the door that represented her only chance for justice. When her fingers finally closed around the door handle, she offered a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening to the pleas of desperate girls in a land far from home. The alley behind Chin's restaurant was darker than the basement had been, but Mei Lin welcomed the shadows that would help conceal her flight toward Dr. Mitchell's office and the journal that contained enough evidence to topple governments. She moved like a ghost through the familiar streets, keeping to the shadows while avoiding the main thoroughfares where Chin's men might spot her during their regular patrols of the town. Every dog that barked, every window that glowed with lamplight, every footstep that echoed from nearby streets made her freeze in terror, certain that discovery was imminent and that she would share Jade's fate before the sun rose. But her sister's memory drove her forward through the fear, reminding her that this was about more than personal freedom or revenge against Chun. The girls still trapped in that basement were depending on her success, along with the unknown victims who would follow if Chin's operation continued to flourish under the protection of corrupt officials. Dr. Mitchell's office appeared ahead like a beacon of hope in the darkness, its familiar outline promising sanctuary and the weapons needed to fight back against the monsters who had stolen so much from so many innocent lives. Dr. Mitchell was waiting inside with Marshall Williams, a tall man with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough human cruelty to understand exactly what they were dealing with in Cedar Falls. The federal marshal examined the journal with growing amazement, his experienced gaze taking in the meticulous documentation that Mei Lin had compiled over months of careful observation and desperate hope. "This is extraordinary," he said quietly, his voice filled with professional admiration for the courage required to gather such comprehensive evidence under impossible circumstances. "We have names, dates, financial records, shipping manifests, and witness testimony that will allow us to prosecute everyone from Chun himself to the territorial officials who enabled his operation." But even as he spoke, the sound of shouting voices and running feet began echoing through the streets outside, indicating that Chun had discovered her absence and was mobilizing every resource at his disposal to recapture her before she could expose his crimes. Dr. Mitchell moved to the window and peered through the curtains, her face pale with worry as she counted the torches moving through the darkness like angry fireflies seeking their target. "They're searching house by house," she reported grimly. "It won't be long before they think to check here." Marshall Williams closed the journal with decisive finality and tucked it inside his coat, his movements efficient and purposeful despite the approaching danger that threatened to engulf them all. "Miss Mei Lin, you've given us enough evidence to destroy this entire network and save countless lives," he said, his formal tone carrying deep respect for what she had accomplished through unimaginable suffering and loss. "But now we need to get you somewhere safe while I coordinate with my deputies to begin making arrests." The plan he outlined was simple but dangerous. Mei Lin would hide in the church basement, while Dr. Mitchell created a medical distraction to draw Chen's searchers away from their location, giving them marshal time to position his men for simultaneous raids on Chen's establishment and the homes of corrupt officials. But as he spoke, the sound of breaking glass came from somewhere nearby, followed by Chen's voice roaring threats and promises of terrible retribution for anyone who dare to help the escaped girl. "She's in this neighborhood somewhere," he screamed, his fury carrying across the night air like the howl of a wounded predator. "Search every building, every cellar, every hiding place until you find her. And remember, I want her alive so I can make an example that will keep the other girls in line for the next 10 years. The hatred in his voice made Mei Lin's blood run cold, but it also strengthened her resolve to see him brought to justice for all the lives he had destroyed in his pursuit of profit and power. The church basement smelled of old wood and forgotten prayers as Mei Lin crouched behind a stack of hymnals, listening to the chaos erupting throughout Cedar Falls as Chen's search parties kicked down doors and terrorized innocent families. Through the small windows near the ceiling, she could see torchlight dancing across the walls as angry men scoured every hiding place in their desperate hunt for the girl who held their destruction in her hands. Marshal Williams had positioned his deputies strategically around town, but they were vastly outnumbered by Chen's network of corrupt officials and paid thugs who had everything to lose if the evidence reached territorial authorities. The sound of splintering wood came from somewhere nearby as another door gave way to Chen's increasingly frantic search, followed by terrified voices pleading innocence while rough hands overturned furniture and destroyed property. Mei Lin pressed herself deeper into the shadows, knowing that discovery now would mean not just her own death, but the failure of everything Jade had died for and the continued suffering of countless other girls trapped in Chen's web of exploitation and murder. Dr. Mitchell's distraction came in the form of a medical emergency that drew half of Chen's searchers to the opposite side of town, where she had strategically collapsed outside the saloon while claiming to have been poisoned by contaminated water. Her performance was convincing enough to create genuine panic among the townspeople, who feared an outbreak of disease that could devastate their community during the harsh winter months ahead. Chen himself was forced to respond to the crisis, leaving his search operation under the command of Sheriff Morrison, whose desperation made him even more dangerous than his employer. "Tear this town apart if you have to," Morrison shouted to his men, his voice cracking with the strain of knowing that federal marshals were already in Cedar Falls and gathering evidence that would end his career and possibly his life. "That girl has information that could destroy us all, and I'd rather burn every building to the ground than let her escape with it." His words carried across the night air with the authority of a man who had crossed too many lines to ever find his way back to redemption or mercy. The closest call came when Deputy Wilson and two of Chen's men entered the church to search for any sign of Mei Lin's presence, their boots echoing hollowly on the wooden floors as they methodically checked every possible hiding place. She held her breath as footsteps approached the basement stairs, pressing herself so tightly against the wall that the rough stones cut into her back through her thin dress. Wilson's voice drifted down from above as he reported his findings to the men waiting outside. "Nothing here but old books and church supplies. If she was hiding here, she's moved on by now." But one of Chen's thugs wasn't satisfied with a cursory search, and Mei Lin heard him starting down the stairs with deliberate steps that promised a more thorough investigation. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain he would hear it, but the sound of gunshots from the center of town suddenly interrupted his descent. "That came from Chen's place," Wilson shouted urgently. "Something's happening at the restaurant. We need to get back there now." The footsteps retreated quickly, leaving Mei Lin alone in the darkness with the knowledge that Marshal Williams had begun his assault on Chen's stronghold. The battle for Chen's restaurant played out like a scene from hell as federal marshals clashed with corrupt local officials and hired guns who had everything to lose from exposure. Through the basement windows, Mei Lin could see muzzle flashes lighting up the night sky like deadly fireworks, while the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood indicated that the conflict had spread beyond the restaurant into the surrounding streets. Chen's voice rose above the chaos, screaming orders and threats in a mixture of English and Chinese that revealed his growing desperation as his carefully constructed empire crumbled around him. "Kill them all if you have to," he roared at his remaining men. "But get me that journal before these federal bastards can use it against us." His words were answered by another volley of gunfire, followed by silence that stretched on until Mei Lin began to wonder if anyone would survive the night to see justice finally served in Cedar Falls. Marshal Williams appeared at the church door just as dawn was breaking over the devastated town, his face grim but victorious as he surveyed the destruction that had been necessary to root out the corruption poisoning their community. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, but he moved with the steady purpose of a man who had accomplished his mission despite the terrible cost in human life and property. "It's over," he told Mei Lin simply, his voice hoarse from shouting orders during the long night of violence and retribution. "Chun is dead, along with most of his inner circle. Sheriff Morrison and Mayor Patterson are in custody, and we've rescued all the girls from the basement." But even as he spoke the words of liberation, Mei Lin could see the sorrow in his eyes as he contemplated the damage that had been necessary to achieve this victory. The town of Cedar Falls would never be the same after this night of reckoning, and the innocent residents who had been unknowingly living alongside monsters would carry the shame and trauma for generations to come. As they walked together through the smoke-filled streets toward a future that suddenly seemed possible again, Mei Lin clutched the memory of her sister close to her heart, knowing that Jade's death had not been meaningless after all, but had planted the seeds of justice that would protect countless other girls from sharing her tragic fate. The aftermath of Chen's downfall revealed the true scope of the corruption that had infected Cedar Falls like cancer, as Marshal Williams and his deputies methodically arrested dozens of prominent citizens whose names appeared in Mei Lin's journal. The territorial courthouse became a parade of shame as respected businessmen, church leaders, and community pillars were led away in chains, their reputations destroyed by evidence that painted them as willing participants in human trafficking and murder. Judge Harrison tried to flee town in the middle of the night, but was captured at the county line with saddlebags full of gold coins that matched Chen's payment records exactly. Bank President Thomas Whitmore, who had laundered money for the operation through fake business loans, barricaded himself in his office and refused to come out until federal marshals threatened to blast the door open with dynamite. The town that had once prided itself on law and order now resembled a war zone, with boarded-up businesses and empty houses marking the homes of those who had sold their souls for Chen's blood money. Mei Lin watched the proceedings from Dr. Mitchell's office, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow as she saw justice finally being served for all the girls who had suffered and died in Chen's basement prison. The rescued girls presented a heartbreaking sight as they emerged from their underground prison, blinking in the sunlight like creatures who had forgotten what freedom looked like after years of captivity and abuse. Most were even younger than Mei Lin had been when she first arrived, some barely 12 years old, their bodies bearing the scars of violence, and their eyes holding the hollow look of spirits that had been systematically broken by monsters who saw them as nothing more than profitable merchandise. Dr. Mitchell worked tirelessly to provide medical care and emotional support, but the trauma they had endured would take years to heal if it ever could be completely overcome. "They don't speak English," she explained to Marshal Williams as they discussed the complex process of returning the girls to their families in China. "And many of them are too afraid to trust any adult after what they've been through." Mei Lin found herself serving as translator and counselor, helping the younger girls understand that their nightmare was finally over while gently coaxing out information about their origins and families that might help reunite them with loved ones they thought they would never see again. The trial preparations revealed even more shocking details about the extent of Chen's criminal network, as federal prosecutors uncovered connections to similar operations in Denver, San Francisco, and Seattle that had been operating under the protection of corrupt officials at every level of government. Mei Lin's journal became the cornerstone of a massive federal investigation that would eventually lead to hundreds of arrests and the dismantling of the largest human trafficking ring in the Western Territories. Her testimony before the territorial grand jury was both powerful and heartbreaking, as she described in meticulous detail the systematic abuse and murder that had been hidden behind Chen's respectable businessman facade. "My sister Jade was 14 years old when they killed her," she told the assembled jurors, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "She died because she wanted to go home to her family, because she believed that human beings should not be bought and sold like cattle." The impact of her words was immediate and profound, with several jurors openly weeping as they contemplated the horror that had been allowed to flourish in their territory, while good people looked the other way or actively participated for profit. The revelation of Chen's crimes sent shockwaves through Chinese communities across the West, as families realized that daughters they had trusted to legitimate employment agencies had actually been sold into sexual slavery by criminals who exploited their poverty and desperation. Letters poured into Cedar Falls from frantic parents who had been searching for missing children, some for years, without knowing what had happened to girls who had simply vanished after leaving for promised work in America. Dr. Mitchell and Marshall Williams worked with Chinese community leaders in San Francisco to establish a network that would help identify and return survivors while also working to prevent future trafficking by educating families about the dangers they faced. "The criminals who did this counted on our silence and isolation," explained Li Wei, a prominent merchant who had lost his own daughter to traffickers 3 years earlier. They knew that Chinese families would be too ashamed or afraid to report their missing children to American authorities. The community's response was swift and decisive, establishing funds to help survivors rebuild their lives while also creating systems to track down and prosecute anyone involved in the trade of human beings. As winter settled over Cedar Falls, the town struggled to rebuild its identity and reputation after the scandal that had exposed the rotten foundation beneath its respectable surface appearance. Many businesses closed permanently when their owners were arrested or fled to avoid prosecution, leaving empty storefronts that served as daily reminders of the corruption that had nearly destroyed the entire community. The remaining residents found themselves divided between those who claimed ignorance of Chen's activities and those who demanded accountability for everyone who had turned a blind eye to obvious signs of criminal behavior. "How do we move forward from this?" asked Reverend Matthews during a town meeting called to discuss the community's future. "How do we rebuild trust when so many of our leaders betrayed everything we thought we stood for?" The questions were painful but necessary, as Cedar Falls began the long process of examining its conscience and determining what kind of community it wanted to become in the wake of such devastating revelations about its recent past. For Mei Lin, watching from the back of the room, the sight of honest citizens struggling with their complicity and seeking redemption offered hope that her sister's death had indeed planted seeds of change that would protect future generations from the evil that had nearly consumed them all. The final confrontation came when Deputy Morrison escaped from custody during a prisoner transfer, taking Sheriff Wilson hostage and barricading himself inside the ruins of Chen's restaurant with enough ammunition to hold off an army. Morrison had snapped under the pressure of facing execution for his crimes, his mind fragmenting as he realized that his corruption had cost him everything he had spent 20 years building in Cedar Falls. "This is all her fault," he screamed from the shattered windows, waving his gun wildly as federal marshals surrounded the building. "That Chinese which destroyed our whole town with her lies and accusations." His voice carried the desperate edge of a man who had lost everything and was determined to take as many people with him as possible before meeting his inevitable end. Marshall Williams tried to negotiate through a speaking trumpet, but Morrison's responses grew increasingly incoherent as he ranted about foreigners and conspiracies while threatening to kill his hostage if anyone approached the building. The standoff stretched through the afternoon, drawing curious onlookers who watched from safe distances as their former sheriff revealed the true depth of his madness and hatred. Mei Lin arrived at the scene despite Dr. Mitchell's attempts to keep her away, driven by a compulsion to face the man whose greed and corruption had enabled Chen's monstrous operation to flourish for years. She could see Morrison's face through the broken window, twisted with rage and desperation as he held Sheriff Wilson at gunpoint, while screaming threats and accusations at the assembled crowd. "You want to end this? she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos with surprising authority. "And let me talk to him. He wants to blame me for everything that's happened, so let him say it to my face." Marshall Williams initially refused, concerned for her safety, but Mei Lin's determination was absolute. "He's going to kill Sheriff Wilson anyway," she argued logically. "At least this way, we might save an innocent man's life while giving Morrison the confrontation he's demanding." The crowd fell silent as she walked slowly toward the restaurant, her small figure dwarfed by the ruins of the building where she had endured years of abuse and witnessed her sister's murder. The conversation that followed was a study in contrast between sanity and madness, as Morrison poured out years of resentment and justification, while Mei Lin listened with the patience of someone who had learned to survive by understanding the motivations of dangerous men. "You think you're some kind of hero," Morrison snarled, his gun wavering between his hostage and the young woman who had brought down his world. "But you're just a troublemaker who couldn't leave well enough alone. Chen was good for this town, brought money and jobs, and you destroyed it all because you couldn't accept your place." His words revealed the twisted logic that had allowed him to rationalize his participation in human trafficking, portraying himself as a victim of circumstances rather than a willing participant in systematic evil. Mei Lin's response was calm and measured, each word chosen carefully to penetrate the delusions that had consumed his mind. "My sister was 14 years old when Chun murdered her," she said quietly. "She wanted to go home to our parents, and you helped kill her for trying to be free. How many other children died because you took their money and looked the other way?" The truth of her words seemed to crack something fundamental in Morrison's psyche, as the full weight of his crimes finally penetrated the wall of denial and self-justification he had built around his actions. His hand began trembling violently, and tears streamed down his face as he confronted the reality of what he had become in exchange for Chen's payments. "I needed the money," he whispered, his voice breaking with the admission. "My wife was sick, and the medical bills were crushing us." Chun offered a solution, and I told myself it wasn't really my business what happened to foreign girls who nobody would miss. The confession poured out of him like poison being expelled from an infected wound, each word revealing another layer of moral compromise that had led him to this moment of absolute ruin. Sheriff Wilson seized the opportunity when Morrison's attention wavered, breaking free from his captor's grip and diving for cover behind an overturned table as federal marshals stormed the building. The final moments of Morrison's life played out with tragic inevitability as he raised his gun toward Mei Lin, his face contorted with the rage of a man who blamed everyone but himself for his downfall. "This is your fault," he screamed one last time, his finger tightening on the trigger. But the bullet never found its target, as Marshall Williams's shot struck him in the chest, sending him crashing backward through the debris of Chen's former empire. As Morrison lay dying among the ruins of the restaurant where so much suffering had taken place, his final words were a whispered apology that came too late to save anyone, including himself. "I'm sorry," he gasped, his eyes finding Mei Lin's face as his life ebbed away. "I'm sorry for what we did to your sister." The silence that followed was profound and complete, broken only by the sound of wind whistling through the broken windows of a building that had finally been cleansed of the evil that had festered within its walls. Standing over Morrison's body, Mei Lin felt a strange sense of completion, as if Jade's spirit could finally rest knowing that justice had been served and the men responsible for her death had paid the ultimate price for their crimes against innocent children. 5 years after the night that changed everything, Mei Lin stood before the newly completed memorial garden in the center of Cedar Falls, reading the names carved into black granite that honored the victims of Chen's trafficking operation. Jade's name was first on the list, followed by dozens of other girls whose bodies had been discovered in unmarked graves outside town during the federal investigation that followed Chen's downfall. Her hair had grown back thick and beautiful, falling in waves past her shoulders, and she wore a simple blue dress that spoke of dignity regained and a life rebuilt from ashes. The townspeople who gathered for the memorial's dedication looked at her with respect and gratitude, understanding finally that the young woman they had once seen as a troublemaker had actually been their salvation. These girls died far from home, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. But they will not be forgotten, and their suffering was not meaningless if it prevents other children from sharing their fate. The applause that followed was subdued but heartfelt, coming from people who had learned to measure their community's worth not by its prosperity, but by how it protected its most vulnerable members. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had become more than a friend during the long healing process that followed the trials and executions of Chen's network. She had served as counselor, advocate, and surrogate family to Mei Lin and the other survivors, helping them navigate the complex legal system while providing the medical and emotional care needed to rebuild shattered lives. Together, they had established the Jade Foundation, an organization dedicated to combating human trafficking and providing support for survivors who often had nowhere else to turn for help. Your sister's name will save lives for generations to come, Dr. Mitchell said as they walked through the garden after the dedication ceremony. Every girl we help find freedom, every trafficker we put behind bars, every family we reunite, it's all part of Jade's legacy. The Foundation's work had expanded beyond Cedar Falls to encompass the entire Western Territory, with offices in San Francisco, Denver, and Seattle that coordinated with law enforcement and immigrant communities to identify and rescue victims while prosecuting their captors. The surviving girls from Chen's basement had taken different paths toward healing, some returning to China to rebuild relationships with families who had thought them dead, others choosing to remain in America, where they had found new purposes and identities. Li Mei had become a translator for the territorial courts, helping other victims navigate the legal system in their native language. Young Precious had been adopted by a kind family in Denver and was now attending school, her bright smile a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. But perhaps most remarkably, several of the survivors had chosen to work directly with the Jade Foundation, using their experiences to help identify traffickers and support other victims in ways that only those who had shared their suffering could truly understand. We know what it looks like when someone is being controlled, explained Autumn Blossom, now 22 and serving as the Foundation's outreach coordinator. We know the signs that others might miss, and we know how to build trust with girls who have learned not to trust anyone. Their work was dangerous but necessary, as they went undercover in suspected trafficking operations and helped law enforcement gather evidence needed for successful prosecutions. Marshall Williams had been promoted to Territorial Deputy Director following his successful handling of the Cedar Falls case, but he maintained close contact with Mei Lin and the Foundation, often consulting with them on complex cases that required cultural sensitivity and survivor expertise. You changed how we approach these investigations, he told Mei Lin during one of his visits to Cedar Falls. Before your case, we focus on arresting the obvious criminals and miss the deeper networks that enabled their operations. Now we follow the money and the corruption, and we're dismantling entire systems instead of just catching individual bad actors. The techniques developed during the Cedar Falls investigation had become standard procedure for federal law enforcement, leading to the prosecution of hundreds of traffickers and corrupt officials across multiple territories. More importantly, the public attention generated by Mei Lin's testimony had led to new federal laws with severe penalties for anyone involved in human trafficking, along with funding for victim services and prevention programs that addressed the root causes of vulnerability in immigrant communities. As evening settled over Cedar Falls, Mei Lin made her way to the small cemetery outside town, where Jade's remains had finally been laid to rest with dignity and love. The simple headstone bore her sister's name in both English and Chinese characters, along with the dates of her short life, and a phrase that captured everything she had meant to those who loved her. Beloved daughter and sister, her courage lives on. Mei Lin knelt beside the grave and placed fresh flowers on the earth, speaking softly in the language of their childhood about the work being done in Jade's memory and the lives being saved because of her sacrifice. The Foundation helped rescue 37 girls this year, she whispered, her words carried away by the gentle wind that stirred the prairie grass. 37 children who will go home to their families instead of disappearing into slavery. Your death meant something, little sister. It meant everything. Standing in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the peaceful silence of the cemetery. Mei Lin felt a profound sense of completion and purpose that had taken years to achieve. The girl who had once been powerless and voiceless had found her strength in the darkest possible circumstances, transforming personal tragedy into a force for justice that would protect countless other innocents from the evil that had stolen her childhood and murdered her sister. Cedar Falls had learned to measure its worth not by the wealth it could generate, but by the safety it could provide to those who had nowhere else to turn for help and hope in a world that too often treated the vulnerable as disposable commodities rather than precious human beings deserving of dignity, protection, and love. Like and subscribe for more incredible Wild West stories that will leave you speechless. Click the video on your screen now to discover another tale of justice and redemption that proves truth really is stranger than fiction. Don't miss these amazing stories that show how one person's bravery can change an entire community forever.